What's it like to make the shift from university lecturer to thought leader? Listen into my conversation with Heather Hausenblas, PhD, on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi there, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to talk with one of our Thought Leader Academy graduates, Heather Hausenblas, about how she has made the shift both in tactically and the content that she's speaking about and what she's doing, but also mindset-wise and identity-wise from university lecturer to thought leader. And that's really why she wanted to come through our Thought Leader Academy, was to help her to make that shift. So we will dive into that today. And then we also will talk about Heather's thought leadership message around social health and social connection. I know that I have been feeling the loss of a lot of social connections since the start of the pandemic. And even though it's been over 2.5 years, blows my mind that it's been that long. I feel like so much of what I was used to doing before the pandemic has not come back yet regarding social connections. So I know Heather's going to have a lot to share with us there that will be very useful. Let me tell you a little bit about Heather before I welcome her. Heather has a PhD and is a health psychology expert, international award-winning scientist. Yes, amazing, which we'll talk about. Public speaker and a best-selling author. Her research focuses on how our health habits affect our well-being. She is ranked in the top 1% of the most influential scientists in the world. She's published 7 books and over 110 peer-reviewed scientific articles. That blows my mind. She is currently a professor of health sciences at Jacksonville University. So she lives in the Jacksonville, Florida area, not too far from Orlando. We actually met at an in-person event where I was speaking earlier this year. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Carol, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
I am too. Let's talk first about the content of your thought leadership message and your signature talk, the one that we worked on together in your VIP day when you were in the Thought Leader Academy, because I think this is going to be something that, like I said in the intro, I am feeling, and probably many of us are feeling, around social connection and social health. So can you set that up for us? What exactly does that mean, and why is it so important?
When we think about our health, we think about our physical health and oftentimes our mental or our psychological health. So how's, our heart rate, our blood pressure, do we have some type of disease? Do we feel, depressed, anxious? And those are all really important for our health. But there's another aspect that we tend to forget about, and that's our social health. And what that means is our social connections, whether it's connecting and spending time with, family, friends, even a stranger, the person who makes your coffee, at the Starbucks. These are all really, really important for our health. And emerging research is now showing that it may be one of the most important things for our health, meaning that we need to connect with others to be healthy. And a study that came out several years ago really highlighted this by showing that our social connections and feeling socially isolated was the worst thing for our overall health. Even worse, for example, than not exercising, than being overweight, than having heart disease. And it just shows how much it actually affects us, and that we need to put just as much time into fostering our social connections and our friends and our family as we do other aspects of our health.
And Heather, when we worked together on this and you shared some of these findings, I was really blown away. I think there was something about even smoking cigarettes is not as bad for you as feeling and being socially isolated.
Yeah, what's interesting is when you equate it, we all know that smoking is absolutely terrible for our health. Ranks right up there at the very top. In fact, it's right now the number one health behavior that we do that negatively affects our health. But what we do find is that when you take all the science together, you kind of put it together, what we find is that being socially isolated and saying that you're lonely has the same health effect as smoking 16 to 15 cigarettes a day.
And of course, like I've never been a smoker, thank goodness. And I would never dream of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I eat healthy. I make sure I exercise. And I know we'll dig into this, yet I know that I haven't prioritized social connections as much as I prioritize these other aspects of my health.
I agree. It's most of us, forget about it. It's something that goes on the back burner, right? If we have a deadline for work, or we, jam pack our schedule with all of these to-do things, but we forget, that we should pencil in during the day, connecting with friends, going for walks. I will often do, for example, walking meetings. And we tend to feel now in this day and age that social media is being socially connected, and it can be positive and it can play a role, but for the most part, the research is really clear that the longer somebody spends on social media, typically the more lonely they are, the worse their overall health, and the worse really their mental health. So it's important for people to realize that, yes, social media plays a role and we're not going to get rid of it, but to realize that you shouldn't be spending hours and hours a day on it, and it's not a replacement for actually being with other people.
And Heather, as I mentioned again in the intro, we've been now over 2.5 years in the pandemic, and obviously through 2020, even into say the first half of 2021, it really was safest for most of us to stay virtual, to do our Zoom meetings, Zoom happy hours, Zoom, group programs, whatever it happens to be. And for sure, I get so much value out of connecting with women like you in our Thought Leader Academy or on podcast interviews virtually here. And yet I know, and I felt in my body, my sense that even just going to the grocery store and having that 2-minute conversation with the person who's the cashier checking out the groceries gives me a feeling of aliveness, like I'm in this world rather than just being on Zoom all the time. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm definitely feeling like more of a desire for in-person connection.
No, you saw this. People were craving it and didn't realize how important it is, that face-to-face interaction. And like I said, yes, close family and friends are really important, but those casual connections that can number in the hundreds a day, whether it's someone you pass, like walking in the hall, or, the checkout person who's bagging your groceries, just saying a simple hi, how are you, a smile, that has an effect on people. And we do know that it does play a role. And unfortunately, we just don't do this enough. And I know even myself, for example, if I'm standing in line, the first thing I'll do is I'll pull up my phone and check it, as opposed to actually try to make a connection with somebody. And we know that just the mere presence of your phone, even for example, if you have it on the dinner table and it's turned upside down, just the mere presence of it is going to reduce, your chances of social connections, and it just plays a negative role.
And Heather, this reminds me, I was recently reading a book, and they mentioned a study that they did about talking to strangers. Like say talking to strangers on the subway or at a train station or something like that, just striking up a conversation with them, not an in-depth conversation or a 30-minute conversation, but just something small. And what they found when they asked people if they'd be willing to do this, so strike up a conversation with a stranger, a lot of them were naturally hesitant. And they said they didn't want to bother the other person. So they were hesitant to do it because they thought it would be bothersome to the person they were initiating the conversation with. But what they found when they encouraged them to do it anyways is that, number one, the person who initiated the conversation with the stranger got a lot of fulfillment out of it. But the stranger who had been, quote unquote, interrupted, they actually got a lot of fulfillment out of it. And they didn't see it as bothersome at all.
I know we tend to have this perception, right? This belief that we're going to bother people. But I always feel, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And to give it a try, and maybe you'll catch somebody and they're really busy and they don't have time and they don't want to chat. But for the most part, we're humans. We're structured for social connections and to connect with people. We needed it to survive, thousands and thousands of years ago. And it's still the same to this day. But unfortunately, we put it really as the low thing for our health on the totem pole. So it's really getting people to rethink that our connections are really important. And people will say, well, how many close friends do I need? Do I need to have 10? What's the magic number? And really what the science says is as long as you have one really strong social connection, that's all that you need. Obviously more will be better, but we can't have, 20 really close friends. It's just not possible. So usually people, the sweet number is around 5 or 6. And then as our social, groups spread out, they play less and less a role, but they still play a role in our overall health.
I remember when we were working on your talk that we had this idea of like concentric circles. So you have the tight, small circle in the middle, and that's your closest family, and then maybe a few friends, and then you have circles out from there.
Yeah, exactly. And they all play a role. There was a study that was done at Harvard, and it's probably the longest study now, and it's still going on. It started around World War II, where it followed 2 groups of men from Boston. One were Harvard graduates and another were from Boston's poorest neighborhoods. And Harvard researchers followed them over time, and it's still ongoing now to see what led to the happiest and the healthiest lives for these men. And what they found over time is really quite shocking. They found that it was the social connections that these men had that led to them reporting that they were the happiest and the healthiest. It wasn't how much money they had. It wasn't whether they became, famous or not. It was really coming down to who their close friends and family were.
So Heather, I want to go into how you got interested in this topic. And so for those of you listening, we'll come back at the end and have Heather share some specific things that we can do to increase our social connections. I know as an introvert, it's not always easy for me to do this. So I know I would like Heather to share some things that we can do. So before we get to that though, Heather, how did you get interested in this? Because I believe your PhD and your research initially were around exercise physiology, right?
Yeah. So I started off really studying the psychological effects of movement and exercise. And at the point when I started this in the 1990s, when I was working on my PhD, we're at that height really of the obesity pandemic, as well as a sedentary pandemic where most people didn't move enough. And most people know, in fact, if you were to survey people, almost 100% will say that they know that exercise is good for them. So knowledge is not enough to get people to move. So that's where the psychology came into play. And that's what I would study. What would motivate people? How can we get them to exercise? How can we get them to keep exercising? What are these psychological benefits associated with exercise? And me and my PhD advisor and another colleague to actually take a look at what happens with our social connections, and do other people, whether it's, a friend or somebody at an exercise class or the class instructor, do they play a role in helping people to actually adhere to exercise and how they feel about their exercise? And at this point, it was a novel study to do because it hadn't been looked at. So that was really about 25 years ago what triggered my interest in how our social environment influences not only just our overall longevity, but also like these things that we do every day, such as exercising.
So is it that if you have an exercise buddy or someone that you know that you're going to go to the exercise class with or walk with, you're more likely to keep at it?
Yeah, the science is clear. It's really powerful that you have that exercise buddy, or if you belong to like an exercise group, for example, you're more likely to exercise. It's that accountability. It's somebody else, there, encouraging you to show up, which is really, really powerful. And what we also found are individuals that you really wouldn't think would necessarily have a powerful influence on people's exercise behavior, such as their physician. So if someone goes to see their family physician, and the doctors to say, you know what, you need to exercise, and almost like give them a prescription for exercise, they're more likely to exercise because they have this kind of authority figure, in a sense, saying that they need to do it. And we call this whole notion of exercise as medicine.
Oh, okay. So Heather, you are an award-winning scientist. You obviously are very well guarded in this area of expertise. You have a PhD in it. You've been working in it for a long time. Why did you decide that you wanted to step into thought leadership? Now, I know you're the stellar scholar, speaker archetype, no surprise. So many of us who come from academic backgrounds, that is our speaker archetype because we love research. We love to find insights in research and we love to share it. So why did this idea of thought leadership appeal to you?
It's interesting, as I've lectured over the years. I've lectured for 25 plus years to students, and it's a challenge to get them to stay engaged and interested in what you're talking about. And oftentimes, as a professor, we put the slides up, we talk about data and statistics, and honestly, it's rather boring. And I wanted to do more. I wanted to go in to my lectures and actually be interested myself and excited and engaged, and get the students to be engaged as well, and really to bring the data to life. And it was meant to be a major coincidence when I was attending a women's conference and you spoke, and I'm like, this is exactly what I need and exactly what I need to do, because I wanted to be able to take the science that is tucked away in journals, and typically the only people who read them are other scientists, and bring this data to life, because it's so important for people's overall health and well-being. And the way to bring things to life, which you've so eloquently done, is by providing the stories behind everything, and that brings it to life. So that was really my main motivation, and for me it was life-changing, and how now I go about in developing my lectures and engaging my students and getting the information out there. If I'm going to be, for example, a keynote speaker at an event, then I've really changed how I go about and do things. Like, for example, I was presenting a study a couple months ago at a conference, and I had people come back to me, the organizers, stating that how I did it was different than everybody else, and that they really liked it because I would tell some stories behind the data. And honestly, that's what resonates, and that's what sticks with people, and that's what they remember. They're not necessarily going to remember that something is statistically significant, but they're going to remember the story behind that data and what it means to people.
Oh, Heather, I'm so glad to hear that, because I know you graduated from the Thought Leader Academy in August. So I haven't chatted with you since then. So I'm so excited to get an update about how you've actually been using and applying what you've learned, particularly around the storytelling aspects of that. And I'll share with the listeners here that is a thing that I feel like almost all the women who we work with, that is what they want to work on the most. Some of us are natural storytellers, but we don't necessarily know how to connect that to our message or to the insights that we're sharing. And then there's others of us who maybe are not natural storytellers. We really like kind of like the hard science and the data, but then figuring out how to make that more relatable to our audience is a great way, like you said, to make it more memorable for them, because we remember stories much more than we'll remember any particular chart or a graph that happens to be on the slide. Is there a story that that has some data behind it or some research behind it as an example that you would want to share with us?
For me, coming back to, the power of social connections. And that's what I tie back some of these stories, because we all have stories, right? About, let's say it's even we had Thanksgiving, right? And that pulls people together, that whole family aspect of it. And I think for myself, in my childhood, and I grew up in Northern Ontario in Canada, and in the summertime, my parents had a camp, which would be the equivalent of like a cottage, a very rustic. It was very rural. We got there by 20 miles on a dirt road. There was no electricity, no running water. And we loved it out there, actually. Like the nature and the swimming and all that stuff was wonderful for us. But the thing that had the most powerful impact on us was the social connections. And what happened every night, we were the only place that had so-called electricity. It was called the Delco system, which actually farmers used to use back in the 1920s to have a little bit of light. And my dad would go and start up this Delco system. We'd have light for about an hour, and all of our neighbors would come over and we'd play cards for about an hour until it would begin to flicker. And I remember that so vividly, and that really had an incredible impact on everybody's overall health, bringing everybody together. So, kind of the take home, I think, for everybody is to really think, about their health. I mean, we watch what we eat, we exercise, but really pay attention to those social connections and how much time you're reaching out to your friends and your family and connecting with them.
So this is what happens when you share stories. So as Heather was sharing that particular story, a couple of different stories popped into my own mind of my own experience when I was younger growing up. And this is what happens when as a speaker, you share stories with your audience. It's okay that the people in Heather's audience or you listening right now have never gone to a cabin in Canada or don't even know what a Delco is or have never experienced that thing. You probably had some things pop into your mind that relate. Like, for example, I remember my sister was here for Thanksgiving and we talked about when we were young, like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, we would play card games all the time. This was the 1980s. There were some computers, but not computers we would use. And there was no cell phones, that's for sure. So we would spend so many of our holiday breaks, vacation breaks, just playing cards with each other. And those are the memories that we have. And then I also remember back in 2012, my husband and I took a hiking trip through Peru with a group of other people. We'd never met them before, but we had a host who put us together as a group of 12, and we hiked through Peru for a week. And even though we had never met them before, we haven't seen them since, we created such strong connections with them because we were there together every day, moving, hiking. And there's no Wi-Fi. There were no phones to use. And it was just so nice to have that kind of back to that, the priority being the social connection and learning about each other rather than it being the distraction of whatever's on the screen.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I think of myself, my childhood, it was the same. We played the board games and we connected that way. And you can connect with people that maybe you don't ever see them again, like you with your hiking friends, but you have a bond. If you were ever to meet up with them again, there'd be that instant bond.
So again, for those of you listening, as you're thinking of stories that you want to share in your presentations, your stories don't have to be like this like amazing big idea light bulb moment. They can be like, that could be maybe your central story, but you could also share some of these other little stories because again, your audience will start thinking of how that applies to them, similar experience they've had. And all of a sudden, you have that sense of longing of, oh yeah, I do, I really do want to connect back with my sister. Maybe we should play some card games or, have those experiences again. So that's the power of storytelling. It doesn't have to be this big traumatic thing or this big idea thing. It can just be these little moments. So we went through the Thought Leader Academy. It was so fun to have you as part of the group. And I know that you connected with the other women who were in there and learned from them as much as you contributed to the group as well. What takeaways do you have from the Thought Leader Academy that you would want to share?
Gosh, well, first of all, it brought together a group of incredible women, which I was really excited about because these women were from all different areas, all different walks of life. So it was really, for me, fun to see how we're successful and bringing us together with these very different areas and seeing, not only our struggles, but our triumphs. And many people in the Thought Leader Academy I still keep in touch with now because it really had that impact because we kind of get siloed in our area, right? And I'm, the university professor, and I didn't, realize that there's all these other incredible women with these incredible stories that really want to become thought leaders within their own area. So that for me was a big thing, as well as just hearing other people's stories and really realizing that stories bring things to life, and that's what we remember.
Yeah, I'm looking back at the women who were with you, and we had women, who work in Hollywood, who do PR for people who are in movies. We have leadership coaches, a photographer. We have a supply chain professional, someone who's a counselor, early education development, someone who's a dietitian, another woman who does sustainability for clothing. I mean, really, like you said, like it runs the gamut of industries. Yeah, what I love is that all these women are coming together because they know that they have something important that they want to share and they want to make a difference in the industry that they're working in.
100%.
All right, Heather. So as I promised, let's come back to social connections. And what are some specific things that we can do to increase our social connectivity?
We don't need to make it as complicated as people may feel it can be. And I like to give kind of quick little takeaways as someone who breaks down the science into kind of digestible things and habits that we can put into play. And one of them is to eat meals with other people. We tend to oftentimes be on the go, there's so many times when I'll be out at a restaurant and you look around and people are on their phones, when they're out with other people. So eat together, especially, if you have kids. We know that when families eat together, the kids end up actually having a higher IQ, a bigger vocabulary, and actually performing better in school. So there's all these byproducts of the simple fact of eating together. And when you put your phone away, it plays absolutely no role. It's honestly it's only going to be negative. So I think that's one of the, a fairly easy thing that we can begin to integrate. And another thing is to pay attention to your casual acquaintances, that person, that maybe you're out walking the dog and you may see them once or twice a week, to say hi and maybe start a little conversation. because those casual connections, which often number, like I said, in the hundreds that we encounter every day, actually play an important role, and we tend to think that they do not. So I think those are, two things that most people can start with, and the fact of reaching out to people and connecting. I know as we're getting out of the pandemic, we talk about Zoom, and that plays a role, and that's a way that we can connect. If you can't physically be with somebody, then there's ways now with our modern technology that we can take advantage of it to stay connected with people.
Thank you for sharing those, Heather. And I will add again, as an introvert, some of the things that I do as well is that I am not a great texter. Like texting my friends and family members is not my primary mode of communication. Get me on the phone or in person, and I am happy to chat with you. Chatting over text is not going to happen, but I try to be more intentional about it and at least check in once a week, with people or, with the family members more often than that. So I kind of make that very conscious that I need to make sure that I'm doing that. It's kind of like, did I eat all my vegetables today? Or did I exercise this week? How many days I wanted to? The other thing that I do, and I know I've talked about this on the podcast as well, is because I am an introvert and I tend to be a little bit shy, especially in larger groups, is that was my strategy why I became a speaker in the first place, way back in the beginning of my career, because I felt like I had a role to play at the event as a speaker. So therefore, people would be more likely to come to me and break the ice and chat with me. And I felt less awkward just showing up at a large conference or an event with a lot of people that I didn't know. And I didn't feel like I had a place for myself. So hence, become a speaker at an event, because that can help you if you feel the same way.
Yeah, that's excellent points.
All right, Heather. So let's go through the questions that we like to ask our guests on the Speaking Your Brand podcast, because we want to encourage all of us to choose women's voices and to be intentional about who we're listening to and watching and reading. What is a favorite book that you would like to share?
Oh my gosh, I read all the time, I guess, as a professor, whether it's, research articles, but I'm constantly reading it. I'm typically reading nonfiction type books. And right now I'm reading a book called Platonic, which is about the power of friendship and how we have different kind of personality types and how certain personality types are drawn together and how it can help you foster your relationships. Like, for example, you being an introvert, and I'm more of an introvert myself. And just because we're, let's say, not the life of the party and talking all the time, it doesn't mean that we're disengaged or we don't want to be there. So it's really important for us to understand that. So that's a book that I'm reading right now that I'm enjoying. But honestly, I'm reading constantly. I take a look at what the New York Times bestsellers are for nonfiction books, and then I usually go and we'll grab one, whether it's an Audible book because I'm outside, walking the dog, or right before bed, to read.
Platonic. All right, I'll have to check that one out. And what's a favorite TED Talk?
Oh, well, TED Talks are phenomenal. And I'm probably going to come back to one that I have watched many, many times. I do believe it's the most viewed TED Talk out there. So many of you have probably already viewed it, but it's by Ken Robinson. And the title of his talk is "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" He actually is, I think, an extremely gifted storyteller. And I think that's in part what makes his TED Talk so engaging. Is he's not only funny, but he throws stories in throughout his talk to get to his point of how creativity is so important, and we tend to squash that in school over, the subjects that are important, but creativity is also very important, like the reading and the writing and the history all play a role, but that tends to take a backside, and it does to creativity. So he does an extremely powerful job in presenting stories around this whole idea of why we need to make creativity just as important as, the reading and the writing in schools.
And a favorite quote.
A favorite quote. Well, it's going to come back to movement. Most of you have probably heard it in some type of rendition, but it's a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And, as a health psychologist, I feel whether you want to start to move more or whether you want a healthy diet or to sleep better, you start with one small, habit change. And over time, that will lead to big changes in people's health.
Fantastic, Heather. And where can listeners best connect with you?
They can best connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, and my company is called Wellness Discovery Labs, where people can connect with me there also, where I do research and writing and speaking on health-related topics.
Great. And I'll have links to those in the show notes for this episode so everyone can find them there. And if you're interested in joining us in the Thought Leader Academy, you can get all of the details and apply by going to speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Heather, congratulations on making the shift from university lecturer to thought leader. I'm excited that your audiences are able to learn from you, not only from your research and data, but also from the stories that you're sharing with them. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You know what, Carol, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everything you do. What you do and bringing together women is incredible. So thank you.